After experiencing 3 very dark souls and 1 journey into the Eldritch, we've finally reached my personal favorite game in From Software's catalog, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. Despite having the least build variety in the series, I've played Sekiro more than any other game on this list by a pretty significant margin. I've done speedruns, clocking usually just under 2 hours. I'm not that good at the game. I've done challenge runs, and I will almost certainly play it again plenty of times. Unlike the rest of the series' more open worlds, Sekiro's levels are far more linear, and the game places more emphasis on its boss encounters as choke points in the levels. The levels build to this constant stream of bosses and mini-bosses to the point where it isn't really possible to go to a new area without running into another one. Luckily for Sekiro, I'm of the opinion that even with the mini-bosses, it keeps a pretty tight quality curve. So, without further ado, let's dive into analyzing the design and success of the boss encounters in Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. But before I do, I'd like to offer an apology to how aggressively wrong some of these names are probably going to be pronounced. I've looked up some pronunciation guides, so I'm gonna try, but I wanted to put that universal apology out there. I wasn't sure if leader Shigenori Yamauchi should even count as a boss, but I think he's got enough going on that he does deserve discussion. You counter Yamauchi for the first time while stealthing towards Kuro before getting your sword, and then have the choice to cross blades with him as you move back through the camp. In terms of design, he's just a beefed up basic enemy with 2 health bars and a bit more damage. Nothing more than that. His vitality and posture are comparatively low to other bosses, and he has no perilous attacks. He doesn't have any non-rhythmic combos. On top of that, there isn't even a reward for fighting him. He might as well just be another enemy who happens to have 2 health bars. On the first playthrough, however, Yamauchi does serve as the game's tutorial boss in a way. He introduces double death blows to the player while putting you against a foe that requires you to engage with the deflecting system. Every other enemy in this area dies in 2 attacks or has their posture broken by a single deflection. Yamauchi takes long breaks between his attacks, particularly compared with later mini-bosses, which means he will struggle to overwhelm a new player in a single combo. It's a great way to get a first-time player into the game while giving them just a little taste of what Sekiro will later have to offer. Because of that, I do give him a C grade. He can't get higher because he is violently simplistic, but serving at the end of a tutorial of a game so complicated and being so accessible means that he does his job with grace. As the first general you encounter, Naomori Kawarada walks another difficult line of design. After Genichiro showed you firsthand how demanding this game plans to eventually become in the tutorial encounter, Kawarada has the role of introducing the core gameplay loop, building new levels of complexity while being far more accessible than the rush that Genichiro provided. Though it's a strange line to walk, I think Kawarada does a solid job. His moveset isn't too complicated, but he has more options than any other enemy up to this point, save that aforementioned tutorial fight with Genichiro. He boasts the game's first perilous attacks, and a posture regenerating move that will extend the fight if you fail to keep pressure on. His standard attacks aren't abnormal, and most of his attacks keep the standard deflection rhythm. With only 1 gourd use at this point, however, the margin for error in this fight is unusually thin for an early game encounter. But his arena does a great job providing unique paths to stealth around and death blow off one of his health bars. Though you could technically do the same thing to Yamauchi in the tutorial, the risk of having to fight a more difficult boss twice in a row with so few resources is a very potent way to force players to start to engage with the stealth mechanics in regards to taking away a health bar of a mini-boss. The best design move in his arsenal, however, is easily his posture regenerating move. In order to avoid losing progression in the boss fight, since posture is usually how you'll kill this guy, the player either needs to stay in melee to keep attacking or make use of the new shuriken tool. This immediately demonstrates the purpose for the prosthetic tool you just found. This fight both encourages stealth prior to mini-boss fights and aggression within dangerous encounters, both skills that are required to succeed in Sekiro. It is a solid piece of design that is simple enough to be understood by a new player, making them feel a little bit better after the butcher house that was Genichiro, while still having enough depth to pose a real threat. I'd give General Kawarada a B grade overall. Though simple compared to later battles, he poses a challenge for new players and an important enough reward in a gourd seed to be a satisfying first real encounter for a new player, and a worthwhile endeavor on later runs. In Dark Souls, it was the Bell Gargoyles. In Bloodborne, it was Father Gascoigne. And in Sekiro, the first real brick wall is the Chained Ogre. The player learns about his weakness to fire through an easy-to-find eavesdrop hint, and then proceeds to watch the ogre break out, grab them, and likely fling them immediately off a cliff while doing 90% of their health in a single blow. Despite not being in the core boss roster, I think the Chained Ogre is in contention for being the hardest fight in the entire game, particularly on a first playthrough. Even though other late game fights obviously eclipse it in terms of demands of the players, the fact that the Chained Ogre appears so early and with so few other options to do prior to facing him means that he is still in solid contention for that title. The only way to get a stealth death blow off is to either run away and wait for him to forget about you for a moment, or use a sugar to stealth up, a strategy new players often won't want to try since consumables are notoriously intimidating on a first playthrough. The end result of this is that a majority of players will end up fighting the Chained Ogre straight out. 2 health bars, no tricks, no skips. His posture bar is absolutely massive, and deflecting his melee attacks is frankly terrifying, meaning new players will focus on evasion, taking the boss down by emptying its continental health bar instead of dealing posture damage. This is one of the only bosses in the game that this happens, by the way. He will make no attempt to block anything you do, which means that it's easy to tell when you can hit him. However, his grab attacks have huge, occasionally shitty hitboxes, and deal just short of your full health bar worth of damage. He leaps towards you, snaps down, charges, all of these will kill you if your health is not maxed out. With only 2 healing items at the absolute most, and the difficulty that comes with taking a health bar while you're in stealth, that means this fight will allow 2 mistakes. One that you heal from, one you bring yourself back from the dead with. And that's, of course, assuming he doesn't immediately throw you to your death. The big lesson being taught here, in my opinion, is prosthetic tools. The Chained Ogre wants you to head into the Kawarada estate and find the Flame Barrel. It makes this fight significantly easier. He is staggered out of almost every single move in his arsenal by the Flame Barrel, and his stagger gives you enough time to land a few hits. On top of that, he gets burned in only 2 hits, taking additional posture damage and recovering slower. If you use the barrel well, you can pretty easily take out one of the ogre's health bars with almost no pushback. It puts a heavy emphasis on eavesdropping in the future, and shows how much the right tool can give you a critical advantage in this game. Though it's a divisive fight, I do personally adore the design of the Chained Ogre, and think he is an easy A-grade boss. He is intimidating, encourages unique mobility, and more than anything else, he is one of the most satisfying bosses to master in the game. And as your reward for taking down the Chained Ogre, you are immediately dropped into another boss fight with a completely opposing concept. Whereas the Chained Ogre was a single unstoppable foe, albeit with a couple mobs in the area nearby, you are now facing General Tenzen Yamauchi. That's right, it's already time for the second general mini-boss, but this time he has a horde of allies, and if you don't guess the right direction to stealth immediately, the bell ringer will set off the alarm and the entire courtyard will begin chasing after you. Tenzen Yamauchi is infinitely more straightforward than the Chained Ogre. The most dangerous enemies, the general included, move pretty slowly, so running around and picking them off, even with the alarm raised, isn't ever overwhelming. The area leans in the player's favor on top of that. With a single jump and wall bounce, you can climb this wall and force the general to walk all the way around to reach you again, letting you fight off a lot of his simpler mobs alone. He feels almost randomly dropped into this arena, particularly considering how silly it is to watch him slowly walk around the wall while you kill his men. The tension you expect from Sekiro fights isn't here as much as it is in the best mini-bosses. I think he earns a high C grade. With a better build-up, he might score better, but his decent moveset and interesting arena do keep the fight from ever becoming too dull. After this collection of very solid mini-bosses at the start of the game, the first main boss in the game introduces himself as significantly more important in a very memorable manner.
My name is Gyoubu Masataka Oniwa!
Gyoubu Masataka Oniwa, or Gyoubu the Demon as he's called by his minions, has a astonishing introduction, and it's not just because it's funny, it's just really good. You leap down to the gate of Ashina Castle, and it opens up to allow this horse-riding spearman to challenge you among burning piles of corpses of every single person who tried before you. His cape is still drenched in blood, and he rides around the arena far faster than you can move or anything else you've seen in the game prior. Before the battle even begins, it is clear that this is the greatest foe you've faced up to this point, even if the Ogre may technically hit harder than Gyoubu does. And after nailing the atmosphere, Gyoubu also does a solid job in terms of his raw mechanics. His introduction serves not only as a fun character beat, but also as a choice for the player. Do you prepare yourself, or do you interrupt and start to deal vitality damage? His attacks can almost all be deflected, and the camera does a decent job trying to keep him on screen at all times. There are definitely some problem points, but it never gets to the point where it's unplayable. The sound design team also deserves a massive nod here. You can hear his spear start to swing before it is about to connect, and when you combine that with the camera accommodations, it's somehow always clear what's happening, despite the fact that this man is one horse higher than you. Gyoubu has two modes: charging around, where he's either spinning his spear or charging directly at you, or he's smashing around him with jumps and slams, encouraging deflections to deal some posture damage. The second mode may be far more dangerous, but it's the one you want, as it's what you'll need in order to raise his posture to end the fight faster. He also has an eavesdropped weakness in firecrackers, but unlike the Ogre, where the fire was a shortcut, there's a lot more happening here. If you use firecrackers too many times, Gyoubu will start to use a counterattack after he's staggered that comes out ridiculously fast. If you figure out the timing of this counterattack, you end up being able to force him into another deflection, which makes the firecrackers have a higher skill ceiling but be even more rewarding. I really love this kind of design. It keeps the use of the tools from becoming spammy while still rewarding players for using them wisely. Finally, Gyoubu has some great story design. In terms of the overall game, he's the first boss, and he's not really one of the most important characters in the lore, but the spear he wields was given to him by Isshin Ashina, and it's the same spear that was used in the introductory cutscene. I love the small details like this in Sekiro because they go such a long way to detailing out the world, to making even this sliver we see seem real and full. Considering the importance that the game's story begins to put on the history of the weapons that you wield, it ends up being a topical way to provide a lore importance for a boss that doesn't have nearly as much as some of the more personal fights. When this all comes together, Gyoubu serves as an incredible introduction to the major memory boss fights, that is, boss fights that provide a memory, which is what I'm classifying as full bosses. Now with that said, there are a couple of issues, namely that his AI can occasionally just give up. He'll charge away from you, and then he'll just keep charging away from you, and charging away from you, and charging and charging and charging, straight into the wall, and he will hit you if you try to interrupt him. It's also possible you can get a fight where he keeps leaving melee combat quickly, which can lead to the encounter getting dragged out to getting close to the point of tedium, but that's pretty rare. Despite that, however, I really enjoy this fight. Gyoubu Masataka Oniwa earns an A grade. Though one of the simpler memory bosses, Gyoubu has so much going on that he stays in the player's head long after he's been taken down off his high horse. After you've traveled back in time to the Kawarada estate, a sentence that will seem outright bizarre to anyone who has not played this game before, we find one of the few unique mini-bosses in the game, the Shinobi Hunter Enshin of Misen. This is one of a very small selection of mini-bosses that only appear in a single boss encounter, with the Shinobi Hunter becoming an elite rare mob after the battle, and may I just say, good fucking riddance. From a design standpoint, the Shinobi Hunter is a Mikiri counter test. Most of his moves are thrusts, and using the Mikiri counter absolutely shatters his posture in just a couple of uses. This mechanical test, however, is one of the only ones in the early game that I believe Sekiro fails to execute. The run back, first of all, is one of the longest in the game. There are archers, shield warriors, and a massive group of bandits in his arena, with one archer in particular being incredibly tough to sneak up on without using a consumable item, which again, first-time players will probably not use trying to get past a single archer. Mikiri counters are much more difficult to land with multiple enemies since you can be hit out of the dodge that initiates the Mikiri, so this swarm of enemies ends up confusing the fight's intent. Worse than that, though, is that the Shinobi Hunter is frankly a really bad teacher for how the Mikiri counter works. The Shinobi Hunter has a combination of thrusts and sweeps, and they aren't easy to tell apart. His standard attacks all come out really fast, and the timing on parrying spear attacks are naturally more difficult than sword strikes due to the delay. An even bigger issue is that his thrusts are somehow the least satisfying thrusts to Mikiri counter in the entire game, namely because his charges seem to have two phases to the attack. He does a charge, which ends with the thrust. You can deflect the charge, but then you get hit by the thrust. But if you Makiri too early, you get double hit. You get hit by the charge as you dodge into it, and then you get hit by the thrust afterwards because you are no longer Makiri countering. Even after playing this game dozens of times, I will still take damage on what felt like a correct Makiri. It doesn't sell you on the importance of this absolutely critical move. So, the horde of enemies makes it difficult to learn how to execute the maneuver, the run back means players will avoid risks within the fight itself, and he fails to even properly teach his mechanic. As an independent Lee, he'd only be given a low D grade because he does technically function. But as a boss, as a mechanical endeavor, the Shinobi Hunter earns an F grade. Being both a required battle to get through Harada Estate and a failed tutorial means that he fails to serve any role to any level of player. Juzuo the Drunkard is a difficult boss to analyze. In terms of moveset, the Drunkard boasts one of my favorites in the game. Their sword strikes are intimidating and heavy, and their raw size makes them feel more significant than mini-bosses like the Generals or Shinobi Hunter. The Poison Breath is punishing, yes, but it also rewards aggressive play if you can manage to get behind him and whittle down that massive health bar. When you combine that with the aesthetic of the burning Harada Estate in the background as this monster of a bandit rushes towards you, you end up with a far above average boss fight. That would be if there weren't so many mobs in this frickin' arena. There is an NPC here to help, but if he dies at all in any attempt, which he most certainly will, I promise you that, then he is gone for good. There are shield bandits to block your attacks, axe bandits with hyper armor, bandits with fire arrows that will inflict burning, and then you suddenly have your posture broken and you don't know why because you have no idea what this condition's doing yet, all while you're fighting a mini-boss whose aggression is second only to the chained ogre at this point in the game. Taking the mobs out isn't even a real option, as Juzuo is positioned in such a way that there aren't many enemies you can take out without using the consumable items. And every time you fight, you have to do all of it again. If there were less mobs, or if they were more carefully placed around the arena to allow for stealth takedowns, I'd score Juzuo higher, but a B grade is all I can give him, and almost all of that is coming from his individual design as a single enemy. When you look back over the game after you've beaten everything, Lady Butterfly is one of the easiest bosses in the game. But despite that, in my first playthrough, there was no boss who killed me as many times as this kunai-wielding, bingo-playing, illusion-summoning old lady. The first thing this fight does well is the atmosphere. Gyoubu had a great presence, yes, but Lady Butterfly is the first fight in Sekiro that has the wow factor. The burning basement with the golden Buddha statue, the music, it all comes together so beautifully, in no short part due to the beautiful build-up to her encounter. The introduction cutscene does a great job implying the connection with Wolf, and that low shot of the two facing off against each other as the room burns is just perfect. Her design is unique, and her actor nails this taunting voice that echoes throughout the entire encounter. In terms of mechanics, she is probably the most defensive boss in this game. She will switch to deflecting almost instantly, meaning dealing vitality damage is incredibly difficult. Thankfully, she also has a really bad posture recovery, so deflections and keeping engaged are the best way to keep her down. This works well to keep you in melee. The rhythm of deflecting and attacking her is just so satisfying to learn. She stays right in your face, and there are these fun gaps in her attacking as she spins for a kick, adding in a unique rhythm to the sword fight. She stays right in your face, and there are these fun gaps in the rhythm of the fight as she does these spins for a kick. It adds in some confusions to the expected rhythm of sword fights within the game, which is what the best bosses in this game do. Her prosthetic weakness is also one of my favorites. I mentioned the back and forth that Gyoubu's firecracker weakness had, and Lady Butterfly's works pretty similarly well. Whenever she leaps into the air, if you hit a shuriken before she lands, she falls to the ground, allowing you to get some actual vitality damage out. If she's made it up onto the wires, however, she'll deflect the shuriken and stay up for longer, recovering more posture. Again, it increases the skill of using tools in combat rather than just pressing a win button. It also serves to reward players who are trying to stay in close combat all the time. However, despite having all this going in her corner, Lady Butterfly is also a deeply flawed boss. Her second phase is a fun fake out, yes, with her seemingly only having one health bar but returning for a second bar anyway, but the general flow of the boss fight is broken by most of her new moves. She can summon these butterflies that do damage through deflections, forcing you to either eat damage or step away to disengage for a moment, which breaks the flow of her so well choreographed dance that made her so satisfying to face. The main problem, however, is her summoning. She will summon 15 to 20 mobs that, after a short time, turn into projectiles that home in on you. Now you can fight the mobs for spirit emblems, but there's no reason to risk it when you could instead run in a big circle. Whatever you do here, she'll spend most of the attack out of reach just regenerating her posture. It's not difficult to dodge the mobs, but it stops the pace of the fight in its tracks completely. The game suggests that the solution is snap seeds, but not only does that only remove illusions in a very small area around yourself, but snap seeds are incredibly rare consumables. This entire attack feels like a neat idea that doesn't hit the mark in terms of its implementation, as it stops you from engaging with all of the things that made the first phase so good. And unfortunately, the problems still don't end there. Lady Butterfly, for the most part, has a pretty solid AI, unless you step count her, because if you do that, she has no idea how to handle your attacks. You can get her in a theoretically infinite damage loop, absolutely slaughtering her vitality, which is completely against what the boss fight is otherwise trying to encourage. The fight does end on a strong final note, however. After you take her down, Wolf is ambushed from behind, and you witness Kuro bless Wolf with immortality. It serves as a great character beat, and putting it behind Lady Butterfly makes it incredibly satisfying to find. Despite being so early in the game, she feels like you just took down someone weighty. On top of that, considering that the player is already about to reach Lord Kuro in the real world, it's a great placement for this moment. Overall, I'd say she earns a B grade. Though the high parts of her fight would be deserving of an A, the bad parts of her fight would barely earn a D grade. So an above average nod seems like the fairest place to put her. And now we travel from a boss that I had mixed feelings on to a boss that I loathe. The Blazing Bull. This is one of the only bosses on this list with a single health bar, but it still feels like one of the most drawn out fights despite that. You wander into an arena and the bull is released from its cage, usually trampling over the other enemies. That said, it's always possible those enemies will survive, in which case, you need to run around for a while to get the boss alone again. The bull is always doing one of two things, flailing wildly or charging around the arena while Tokyo drifting as he prepares to charge the other direction. It has a ton of health, even if you have both available memories at this point, and deflecting his attacks builds up the burn status, which dissuades you from hitting his weaker face. More than anything else, the bull is simultaneously exceptionally boring and exceptionally irritating. It does a ton of damage, which means you have to always be on guard, and hitting it involves running in a big circle around it and getting a single hit off while it's Tokyo drifting. It is weak to firecrackers, but it has such a massive health bar that even a few seconds of attacking without thinking barely makes a dent. On top of that, the bull is the only fight I believe the camera in Sekiro regularly fails. The camera, for the most part, is pretty successful in this game. It dynamically moves along with the bosses, trying to keep them and their attacks on screen to react to. Though this often makes being in a corner difficult, as the camera will continuously try to push back into the wall, it does better than the other games in the series at universally keeping most enemies visible. The lock-on for the bull, however, is just behind its head, which is the worst place it could possibly be. This placement, however, makes it feel like you're fighting to point the wolf in the correct direction for the entire fight. You can't lock onto the head, making staggers less reliable, and you can't lock on while behind it. Unsurprisingly, for most people who have played Sekiro, the Blazing Bull earns an F grade. It's not fun to fight, and it's made even more frustrating by being a required fight placed almost directly after such an incredible introduction to the castle proper. As the last of the general encounters, Kuranosuke Matsumoto somehow manages to be the most mediocre of the bunch. He has a troop of ranged enemies around him, and his AI doesn't notice when they die, which means you can just use Shuriken from the bottom of the staircase and turn him into a one-on-one pretty easily. This is particularly funny if you do it while he's monologuing about the importance of teamwork. His moveset is a bit more complicated than his fellow generals, as he uses both grab and sweep attacks, and he boasts the most overall damage. He's clearly meant to serve as a final test of this introductory mini-boss before they return as enemies in the latter half of the game. He also has the best introduction of the three generals. The first two were kind of just vibing in their arena before you ran up, with Yamauchi standing behind the Ogre for some reason, but Matsumoto was in the middle of a speech preparing the troops for the incoming attacks. Judging by how those attacks ended up going, he obviously did a bad job here, but interrupting the speech of this general makes for a fun setting for the mini-boss fight. There's not much else to say about a third general fight, but he still earns a solid C grade. Though not incredible, the enemy template is solid enough that it still has an outstated welcome as a mini-boss for me. I don't think there's another boss on this list as capable of killing you as quickly as the Ashina Elite, and I absolutely adore that. You wander into his room, there is no way to stealth off a health bar here, there is nowhere to back off to, there is no room to heal or breathe. He is a one-trick pony, and he's going to do this. He's going to sheath his sword, he's going to do the Ashina Cross, and it's going to damage you through block at a blinding speed. The catch is, if you deflect his attack twice, then you've finished one of the phases. He is a deflection test, not a blocking test, a deflection test. If you deflect perfectly, you win. If you don't, you die. They put a checkpoint literally feet before the boss fight, knowing it might take players a few attempts to really internalize the timing here. Though Jinsuke is simplistic, he does a great job testing your deflection skills, especially considering what the game is about to throw at you once you get through this fight. He has a solid test that makes you feel incredible once you pull off a kill. He earns a B grade. Now, if he was more complicated, he'd potentially be lower with how unbalanced the damage is, but a deflection test fits really naturally at this point in the game, and executing this fight well is just so satisfying. And when you finally reach the top of the castle, you are put face to face with the man who took your arm at the end of the tutorial. From a story perspective, this fight happens shockingly early on in the game, but the stakes in the story help this fight hit really hard. Genichiro, despite rarely being on screen, has a great presence in Sekiro and really sells his role as the villain here. And it's rare that a game has you face the main villain before diving into the mid-game. Compared to what comes before, Genichiro is an overwhelming challenge. He doesn't have the same weaknesses bosses prior had, and he uses his bow to punish passivity. His sword dance attack is a brutal onslaught, and by far the most brutal one this early in the game, and he's the first enemy to boast 3 health bars, with the third deeply changing his moveset and introducing a new mechanic. Despite the challenge, or perhaps because of it, I adore Genichiro so much. He mainly uses thrusts and sweeps, though he does occasionally pull out a grab. One of the best parts of his moveset is this jumping attack. In the first phase, he always follows up with a thrust. In the second phase, there's a split chance to do a thrust or a sweep. In the third phase, he can thrust, sweep, or do a modified sweep that will need to be deflected instead of jumped. There's a lot of fun details like this that keep the battle from feeling predictable as you engage, and leads to a feeling of progression throughout the fight. The arena is pretty small here, with no cover and Genichiro's bow. There's never anywhere to hide from the onslaught of attacks. This isn't a fight you can back out of. You have to show that you are ready to deflect, counterattack, and take every window you can get out on top. Every tool the game has taught you, from the generals to the ogre to Lady Butterfly, all come to a head here, in this first real test of mastery of mechanics. As I mentioned, the fight introduces new mechanics on top of that, being the first fight to feature lightning deflection in the third phase. It allows you to either step through and punish, or take the risky reflection for massive vitality and posture damage. I mentioned the fight is incredibly brutal, and it feels right to be so difficult when you're facing the main villain this early. Despite having only encountered at most 2 other memory bosses, this game has already taught you well enough that what was designed to be a near unbeatable fight in the tutorial now feels not only doable but very possible. The combat system is on full display here, and the player feels their progression, not mechanically, but as a player. This fight felt almost impossible at the start of the game, and now you're here, and you're barely into the real heart, the real meat of what Sekiro has to offer. It makes the encounter so satisfying, and Genichiro is an easy S-grade boss. It's also worth noting that Genichiro has an inner version within the Reflection of Strength mode, and it is an incredible redux. They basically just redo the base chassis of the fight, improve it a little bit, add in a couple more moves to spice things up, keep things a little more difficult, and scale everything for post-game, and it just works really well to have these couple fights that stick out. They don't really feel like new bosses, even if they may have a couple new moves. They feel like rematches, like New Game Plus variations. Throughout FromSoft's catalog, only one thing has been a universal rule. There is no greater force than gravity. And in a strange twist, you finally wield the power of gravity in the battle with the Armored Warrior. The Armored Warrior doesn't have much in the way of build-up. He strolls up on the tight bridge, he looks like Dark Souls at home, and he yells something about his son before he starts swinging his greatsword. He seems to have plenty of openings, but the first time you hit him reveals that, plot twist, this is a gimmick fight. The Armored Warrior is immune to damage. You cannot hurt him. Even if you fill up his posture bar, he won't die. You'll just push him forward a little bit. In order to beat him, you have to break his posture and then execute a death blow that will push him off the bridge and to his death below. I really do love the concept for this fight. Armored Warrior's attacks feel incredibly distinct from everything else in the game. The timing, the way his arcs swing, everything makes him feel out of the ordinary, which is great. The unique way of beating him is a fun change of pace, too, and he's definitely the best boss built around having a single health bar. Oftentimes, gimmick fights are defined by rejecting the core gameplay loop. Yorm forces you to use a different weapon, the Bed of Chaos is the Bed of Chaos, etc. The Armored Warrior succeeds as a gimmick boss by varying the primary gameplay loop, removing a key tool of damage, and replacing it with positioning. All the mechanics are still present, you just have this one unique shift while maintaining everything else. It's a much more clever use of a gimmick. My praise for him, however, ends there. His moves can be deflected, but missing a deflection is often so punishing that I find myself standing out of the way of his larger attacks and combos, then coming in at the end to land one final deflection and hit him a couple of times. On top of that, there are a number of weird hitboxes with falling off of the bridge, and he struggles to register as falling if you push him diagonally. Now that's not too big of an issue, but it is frustrating whenever it happens, especially when you're going in blind and trying to figure out how to kill him for the first time. Finally, and most frustratingly, I believe the game massively leads you astray with a very messily placed eavesdrop hint. Just before you get the spear, there is a pair of guards that talks about getting the big guy into armor, and how swords won't break through it, but a spear could easily tear through it. Now, they were talking about a completely random mob. There are big hammer guys wearing armor, they have more health unless you use the spear to take it off. I was convinced that the spear had to be connected to the Armored Warrior. After all, the eavesdrop hint described a big guy who had been forced into a suit of armor, and now you could tear it off. It was earlier in the path towards this warrior, and the guy who gave you the key to the spear described the invincible big guy. I'm not sure if I'm alone in this experience, and I've just now announced how dumb I am to all of YouTube, or if I'm just disappointed that the game made me super excited for this fight, and it was just pushing someone. Again, the fight's decent, but I always found it disappointing. This may be completely personal, but it hurts the fight as an encounter to the point where I think he only earns a C grade, falling short of the above average callouts. With that said, he screams when he dies, and it is the best voice acting in the game. That is S-grade voice acting, and that man deserves a raise. You hear about the disgusting experiments of Senpu Temple all throughout the world of Sekiro, but most of what you see when you arrive are just monks and crickets. It's not until you stumble upon long-armed centipede Sen'Un, likely your first long-armed centipede, that you realize how horrifying this temple is. The dark environment being lit by the fire of his minions is a lovely touch, and the rafters above him having a fight creates this fun source of tension where falling means facing the boss at full strength and at a disadvantage. However, though this beautiful boy may be listed as the boss, that is a goddamn lie. These little things are the boss here. Their burn attacks stack on top of each other, stagger you out of blocks and deflects, require complete repositioning, apply burn quickly, and they are really evasive, some of the most evasive in the game. Plus, the fact that they can deflect makes Shuriken less helpful than usual for taking out small ranged enemies. In terms of the boss fight itself, the long-arm centipedes are okay. They really only have two moves. A storm of swings that do very little posture damage, encouraging you to deflect their posture upwards, and an easy-to-punish sweep. One nice thing is that their sweep is probably the easiest in the game to learn how to perform a stomp counter on, so I appreciated that attack a lot. Though the arena does create a fun source of tension, the irritation caused by the mobs that inhabit it make this fight one I wish I could avoid. Overall, I think long-armed Centipede Sen'Un earns a D grade. Though the arena does create a fun source of tension, the irritation caused by the mobs that inhabit it make this fight one I wish I could avoid. I have mixed feelings about the folding screen monkeys. This is a puzzle boss. You have to find and kill 4 monkeys, each with a unique trait. One has amazing eyesight, so it needs to be ambushed from behind quickly and quietly. One has amazing hearing, but horrible eyesight, which means overwhelm its sense of hearing and you'll win the day, but you can't sneak up on it normally. The screaming monkey doesn't have any special abilities, but it screams loudly if it sees you, alerts everything around it, and is also the worst monkey, and I hate him. The invisible monkey, meanwhile, is invisible and somehow the least obnoxious one. To win, you need to kill all 4 before the terror-inflicting monkeys in the arena kill you, which is effectively a non-threat. Terror is an instant kill, but the monkeys don't have much offense that they can dish out. On your first playthrough, the fight is decently fun. It's exciting to find the unique ways in the arena to trick the monkeys and earn a killing blow, and the game does a lot to keep it from getting obnoxious. You can always reset the room back to its basic state, and there's an NPC giving hints, though the terror monkeys attack you while talking to him, which feels like a bit of an oversight. The introduction also does a good job showing you what the monkeys' gimmicks are, and there's more than one way to take down each of the monkeys. After that first playthrough, like so many gimmick bosses, the battle loses a lot of its shine. Trying to pin down the monkeys becomes a tedious experience. I want to speed through it to get the memory and move on to the rest of the much better bosses in the late game. But with that said, there is a really fun speedrun strategy that makes the fight ridiculously satisfying to pull off. Pop a sugar at the start before entering the arena, kill the invisible monkey, run up and stealth the screaming monkey, if you can successfully stealth the screaming monkey, hop to the center and use a firecrackers, which will let you kill the hearing monkey, then climb up and follow the seeing monkey, jump down the pit, turn around and firecracker, and just like that, the fight is over in less than a minute, and I did that really sloppily. It is a very satisfying strategy to master. Because of the frustration that not knowing the route can lead to, however, I can't give the monkeys a good grade. But allowance is made for the new players, and the ability to dominate the fight if you know what you're doing means that it does still earn a D grade. Except for the screaming monkey, I would like that thing to die, please. Thank you. Upon returning to the reservoir that you began the game in, you'll be able to notice a general with a spear investigating where you found Kuro at the very beginning of the game. Work your way back through the opening area, and you'll find yourself face to face with, and hold on to your seats for this one everybody, the 7 Ashina spears Shikibu Toshikutsu Yamauchi. This boss's name is matched only by the length of his spear, a weapon made even more terrifying by his damage output. He also has the first matching name within the game, sharing the family name with General Yamauchi, and I definitely did not just notice that for the first time when creating this list of bosses. The 7 Ashina Spear's enemies are, to put it simply, one of the most detailed mini-boss enemies in not only all of Sekiro, but potentially From Software in general. These spear wielders have movesets with more detail and fake-outs than some full boss fights in this series. On a first playthrough, there aren't many enemies nearly as terrifying. The damage is massive, they're hard to escape, they're aggressive, and almost every attack is perilous or hard to deflect because of the unique rhythm of the spear. But more than any other boss in the game, something just clicks with these enemies. This moveset is the perfect iteration of the fundamentals of Sekiro. The way you deflect in the Mikiri counters, have to deal slight damage to maintain posture. The 7 Ashina spears, specifically this one because we will get to Oniwa later, feels like the mini-boss that embodies Sekiro combat more than anything else. Fighting this boss in the same place you began the game feels so fitting because he represents to me everything that makes the bosses and mini-bosses so compelling. He earns an A grade, and considering he is a spearman with no cutscene, no story, and no wow factor, that is very high praise. The first of the 7 spears was fought where you found Kuro, and the first lone shadow is fought in the well you were dropped into and spawned in for the first time you booted up the game. He serves as a required mini-boss to reach your second ingredient for the aroma. You can land a diving attack onto him for a shorter fight, or run up for a more painful one. There are a lot of lone shadows in this game, and the Longswordsman suffers from being the introduction to the enemy as a boss, and having no real unique twist. Though the lone shadows do serve as fun enemies to fight with their high mobility and long combos that glide across the ground, the Longswordsman doesn't do anything to change how the player feels about that. I mean, at this point, you've already run into a lone shadow in the Harada estate who serves as a much more terrifying introduction to the enemy than a mini-boss, which feels a little backwards. In addition to not really doing anything to feel exceptional, the well here does not feel well made for combat. The fog gates around the arenas are common, but they feel strange when the area is so small. It feels like an artificially placed wall that you're designed to fight against. This is also a particularly tight space to fight a lone shadow in, as its sweep attack flies across more than this entire arena. Though keeping pressure on a player isn't a bad thing, it's a strange place to fight an enemy whose mobility is so crucial to its design. Combine that with the fact that the camera, which is usually pretty good, is horrendous here. The lone shadow almost instantly will kick you against a wall, and the camera will completely lose it. Because of this, the first lone shadow earns a D grade. His moveset keeps him above an F grade, but his uninspired arena and atmosphere keep him from any kind of real success. Once you take the leap down the bottomless pit, the wolf finds himself at the base of the map in a poison swamp. God damn it, Miyazaki! As you start to explore the area, you start to get sniped by Snake Eyes Shirafuji. As you go to Shirafuji, you start being sniped by these other enemies that were hiding just around the room with sights on their boss. There are 2 totems in this room, each providing different places to approach this battle from, and they're both obnoxious runs. There are so many enemies in so many different places that trying to stealth your way around is so much easier said than done. On top of that, Snake Eyes is personally one of the hardest mini-bosses in the game. She does a ton of damage. The fact that she's using bullets half the time means that perfect deflections won't increase her posture bar for a lot of moves, and for a sniper, she poses a frankly ludicrous threat within close quarters. I think the moveset does leave a lot to be desired as well. Her grab attack can be parried, which is a cool interaction that raises the skill ceiling a little higher, but the rest of the moveset lacks a lot of diversity, especially with how tanky she is. She grabs and shoots, or swings and shoots. That's it. Combine that with a restricted space that suffers the same fog wall problem as the Longswordsman, and Shirafuji is just not a fun fight. I feel like this fight wants to be a stealth challenge. Move around the arena and take out the snipers, leaving Snake Eyes vulnerable. Snake Eyes, however, is just too powerful of an enemy to ever be described as vulnerable. But going straight for her, unless you know some incredibly specific routing, ends up with a very frustrating fight. You're either backed into a corner, hoping for her to stop shooting at you and come down so you can fight her with a bad camera, or you're in a poison swamp and you're being sniped at from random enemies. That said, unlike the Shinobi Hunter, there's enough interesting happening with her moveset that I don't believe that is a complete failure. Overall, I think it earns a D grade. The design of a gun used as a club is also a really fun idea, and the Poison Swamp, as much as I hate to say it, does have a great atmosphere. Juzuo the Drunkard struggled to introduce the mini-boss template in its first battle, but Tokujiro the Glutton does a significantly better job introducing the mini-boss. Like Juzuo, Tokujiro is surrounded by mobs. Unlike Juzuo, Tokujiro is surrounded by 3 monkeys wielding swords and a monkey with a gun, which is far less of a force to overcome than Juzuo's army of bandits. Even a couple shuriken can turn the fight into a much more satisfying one-on-one. However, where Tokujiro struggles compared to Juzuo is the atmosphere of the fight. You run into Tokujiro while traversing the fog of the Mist Noble, which we'll get to in a second, where you're fighting off spirits and ghosts in this strange fog. And then, as you climb your way through the forest up towards Mist Noble, you come through to a clearing where there is a really big drunk guy and his monkey friends, which frankly comes out of absolutely nowhere. Once the Mist Noble is dead, Tokujiro fits the area much better. He's a hermit drunkard living with monkeys in the ruins of a once great city. It makes a lot of sense, especially compared to a hermit drunkard living with monkeys in the ruins of a once great city where the dead are now rising as wrathful spirits due to an immortal being playing the flute to fill the area with an unnatural choking mist. I feel like the atmosphere issues hurt Tokujiro in the same way the mobs hurt Juzuo. It may not hurt him as much, but I still think Tokujiro doesn't go above a B grade in terms of the encounter. I wish we had a solid fight against a Drunkard earlier in the game, but the game just isn't putting them in the best environments to show off how fun this enemy is. In terms of atmosphere, the Mist Noble is one of the better mini-bosses. Kinda. The entire level is covered with spirits brought forth by its music, and your entire effort in the area is all to get into this pagoda that the noble sits within. As you approach, you hear its music. It's alone, calm, and strange. You climb through a hole in the wall, and looking through the rafters, see this disgusting, abnormal thing playing the flute. You leap down and get your sneak attack, and then you swing a couple of times and he's dead. That's it. That's the whole fight. Honestly, there's barely even a mini-boss here. The mob version of Mist Nobles, later in the game, put up more than a fight than the actual boss did. Why does this enemy have 2 health bars? Why is this the culmination of the area? It ends up just feeling silly. Now, granted, the Mist Noble is hilarious and has been memed to oblivion and back, because people just don't realize the Mist Noble is holding back and could kill you in one hit instantly without you even being in the arena if he really wanted to. He just doesn't want to. People do speedruns seeing how fast they can die to this guy. That's how little he can do. Do I love Mist Noble? Yes. Is he an F-grade boss fight with a great build-up? Also yes. Following directly after one of the most bizarre and underwhelming boss fights, we're met with one of the most unique and challenging bosses in the game. Since you've left Ashina Castle, you've met a man searching for a song he feels is calling to him. Once you kill the Mist Noble and reach Mibu Village, the man finds the person playing the song, and she kills him. Orin of the Water stands in the village and plays her instrument, crying, asking any passerby if they know where Lord Sakuza is. If they lie and say they know where he is, if they deny her or they try to run past, she gets violent. Fast. The actor playing Orin absolutely nails the performance here. Within just 2 lines, she feels like a dangerous, unhinged spirit. There are a few vocal performances in this game that do a similar thing, but Orin is a random person in the overworld, and that vocal performance alone carries more weight than some intro cutscenes. In terms of combat mechanic, Orin also stands from the crowd of mini-bosses. She can become incorporeal, allowing your attacks to pass through her. Combined with brutally fast attacks, a massive collection of sweeps, and the fact there's no way to stealth off one of her first health bar, Orin is also one of the more demanding mini-bosses, and is all the better for it. Mibu Village has a great atmosphere, but doesn't really do much with it until you run into Orin, who makes full use of the village's uncomfortable environment. My one wish for Orin is that I wish she was a fully designed boss encounter. She has the story and atmosphere of a full encounter, but her moveset, though not fully limited, doesn't feel as expansive as the bosses often do. Orin of the Water still earns an A grade. After all, wanting more of a fight is never a bad sign of its quality. Finally, after diving down through the deepest depths of Ashina, you find the Corrupted Monk, a spectral figure who is really upset at you for some reason. Another of the rare 1 health bar opponents, the Corrupted Monk is a tale of 2 bosses. If the player spams firecrackers, snap seeds, and fistfuls of ash at it, it is almost comically easy to stunlock. I can't personally execute the trick, but there's even a way to land a stealth death blow on the monk, killing it instantly and skipping the fight. On the other hand, if you don't cheese her, she's one of the most intense fights for this point of the mid-game. Spins, lunges, ridiculous posture recovery, delayed swings due to a massive side difference and the long swing of the glaive. There is a lot going on in this one enemy. When you combine those strange attack delays with the level of damage she can output, this is a really demanding mid-game fight. Which I feel like I'm saying for all the Sekiro bosses, but it's a pretty demanding game overall, so it's kind of a universal. But looking at the fight holistically, Corrupted Monk suffers from a strange syndrome. Despite the threat that it poses and the massive increase in size from any boss up to this point, the Corrupted Monk doesn't escalate throughout its phase and doesn't have a big finish. It feels like it's missing its second half. Namely because it is. This is the first phase of a later game boss fight, missing the second and third health bars. The Corrupted Monk is here to introduce the tempo and threat of Sekiro's endgame to the player in a simpler fight, but considering how easy it is to cheese, it often ends up feeling more underwhelming. It means that you throw things at it, nothing really changes, it doesn't do anything, and then you stab it and it's dead. Overall, I think the Corrupted Monk's spirit form earns a B grade. The moveset is solid, really fun stuff going on here, but it's too open to cheesing, especially since you only need to rush down a single health bar, and an intentionally incomplete design lacks a lot of the story impact other full encounters pack. Whenever I replay Sekiro, the Corrupted Monk serves as a speed bump on the way to the bosses I'd rather be fighting. It's not bad, it's fun to fight, but it just doesn't work as well as you'd expect a moveset like this to work. Heading into the Sunken Valley, we're going to get a couple of boss rematches, the first of which is Snake Eyes Shirahagi. Like the first Snake Eyes, I'm not much more of a fan of this one than I was the one before. With that said, I think that this version of Snake Eyes does achieve its purpose in the game much better than the first does, namely because of the unique level design that the enemy sits within. In every other Souls game, hell, in action games in general, mobs are obstacles you overcome in order to battle the primary opponent. Shirahagi is exactly the opposite. She's the first enemy after the totem at the gun fort, and in order to head deeper within, she's what you have to face, with the later mobs shooting at you from further within the area. Though the sniping mobs are certainly still frustrating, it's done with significantly more intent. The battle is set at the base of a statue that gives natural cover without breaking the camera in the same way the hallway of the first Snake Eyes did. With the battle happening at the base of a statue, it provides natural cover that feels more satisfying than fighting the first Snake Eyes in the restrictive hallway. I still think the moveset isn't particularly strong and her damage is overtuned, but Shirahagi feels like she earns her place among the boss roster with a high D grade, with her interesting map placement carrying a weaker mini-boss template. Similar to Sen'Un in the Senpu Temple, the long-armed centipede giraffe is a simple foe. He swings wildly or he sweeps his claws across the floor. The difference is that Sen'Un is in a wide atmospheric space with mobs and vertical layers, and Giraffe is in a broom closet with a fog gate blocking half of the room off for some reason. I already mentioned I don't particularly like it when the fog gates are in the middle of a room, but this one is particularly baffling. There is literally a door 5 feet past the fog. Just put the fog wall over the door. I don't understand why there is a giant fog wall in my camera's face here. Like in all tight spaces, the camera begins to struggle a lot here. There's not much space, so your back is against a wall, which is where Sekiro begins to struggle. Oftentimes, that struggling rewards you with a strange and not particularly pleasant angle of Giraffe's face that only a mother could love. But with those complaints said, I actually really enjoy Long-Arm Centipede Giraffe. The moveset is a lot more entertaining in a really small space, and the absurdity of the enemy ends up being more on display here than the creepiness of it. Combine that with no mobs, and you start to enjoy the feeling of deflecting this insane flurry of attacks, something not many other enemies can provide. I've heard other people call Giraffe a joke boss, and though I don't think that's true, there's definitely something entertaining about being trapped in a broom closet with what feels like a rabid Wolverine. Personally, I think Giraffe sits in a B grade for me. Despite any flaws the design has, he's just fun to fight. Also, I love the fact that his name is Giraffe. I hope you're ready for the hot take of the video, because here it comes. The Guardian Ape is one of, if not the best designed large monsters in the From Software catalog, with the only other boss even getting close being Ludwig's first phase. Now before even touching on the Guardian Ape's moveset, I need to mention the camera. We've just seen a couple of fights where the camera has not worked particularly great. The Guardian Ape is the exact opposite. It works insanely well here. It's constantly backing out far enough that you can always see the ape, but not far enough out to be disorienting. The ape's AI hates being against walls, meaning you often don't end up pinned at awkward angles, which is particularly crucial for how important spacing is in the fight. The next thing to mention though is the ape's animations. It is uncanny how detailed this enemy is. Every thrash, every run, every attack flows into each other. The ape never stops moving, and it feels so natural. Though hard to read at first, the animations are clear and distinct. Placing water on the ground created this sense of weight to every attack as the entire pool splashes and ripples as the ape slams and leaps. The dead trees that serve as grapple points are destroyed over the course of the battle, which is a great touch. They initially provide an escape route, allowing you to escape the ape in tense situations that you weren't quite ready for, but they slowly become more and more scarce over time, as eventually there is nowhere that you can escape this beast. But finally, moving to the mechanics, the Guardian Ape is an incredible battle. Anything that isn't a grab attack can be deflected, and like most beasts, it's weak to firecrackers. Unlike things like the Corrupted Monk, the Guardian Ape cannot be as easily staggered and cheesed, at least not without serious planning. There is a speedrun strat, but it's not something that you'd see realistically done. But the most impressive part of each of the ape's attacks is that they all have unique variations based on how it landed in the last attack. If it ever stands up, it's always standing as part of the movement into the next attack. If it lands on the ground, it's landing to start thrashing around or to crawl away. There are almost no moments where the fight returns to a neutral stance. The ape is always aggressive. If you attack from behind, it'll do a poison fart, and I can't believe I'm saying this, before it runs away and throws a ball of its toxic shit at you the size of its own body. If you hit its head for enough damage, it staggers, and if you keep hitting it, it falls back and scrambles away, terrified of you. It's easy to feel like you're overpowering a boss with attacks, but I've never felt like I legitimately scared the boss before. This animation is so smooth and so gorgeous, it makes the fight feel so real, and helps him avoid getting cheesed. Now, the one issue that I do see occasionally pop up is those aforementioned grab attacks, which do require some often unnatural dodging to avoid. Once you do figure it out, though, you'll be able to slowly take down the ape's health, eventually getting this amazing final blow where you tear off its head with the sword embedded in it. What an incredible fight. But this is Sekiro. You die twice, bosses die twice, monkeys die twice. Now he is a monkey, and that aforementioned sword is in one hand with his head in the other, and the whole fight works differently now. He inflicts terror, and there's a centipede in his body you can rip out with the spear. He gets this wild combo that the camera zooms out for, and when you deflect the last strike, he collapses onto the ground, and it is oh so satisfying to land. Every single move is changed. The Guardian Ape is two polar opposite bosses back to back, each with different challenges, and it is terrifying. More than anything, the boss just feels alive through both phases and ridiculously consistent. The first phase moves so naturally that it feels like they did motion capture on an angry gorilla, and the second phase is so beautifully uncanny in contrast and so unnatural with each jittering movement that it sells the horror of the immortal curse so well. I cannot overstate how good this fight looks and feels. This ape is a masterclass in animation in a series that boasts some of the best in the business. Yes, it has a few less than stellar attacks. The grabs in the first phase and the scream in the second are a little obnoxious, but I cannot criticize this fight for long. It terrifies me in the absolute best way and deserves every accolade that it could possibly receive. Guardian Ape is the second fight I'm putting in the S grade, and probably wins my personal award for the best individual animations of any boss in this series. I love it so much. And as we return to Ashina Castle for the endgame, we rematch our good old friend, the Chained Ogre. Scaled for the start of the late game now, this Chained Ogre changes the formula by being in a tighter room, forcing precise play without much additional space to maneuver. It's a fun twist on the encounter for most of it, but I also think it misses a bit of the fun. Every throw now just puts Wolf against a wall where he just stops moving and then starts to fall. What once had some charm and could potentially lead to funny deaths now starts to look rough around the edges. Now, I'm not sure how that would be fixed, but an enemy who throws you around the room not having space to throw you around the room struggles with its identity. On top of that, this Chained Ogre feels a bit like filler. It's not in your way like the first Chained Ogre this time. You have to hunt this one down to face it and get your prayer bead. Though I think hidden mini-bosses are good, and I think repeat mini-bosses can be used well, this Chained Ogre ends up feeling more like a prayer bead dispensary than a meaningful obstacle or an interesting challenge to seek out. A reuse of an enemy just because the enemy was present, rather than a reuse with intent. It still earns a B grade, though not nearly as memorable. The fun design of the boss itself still earns it a solid nod. On my first playthrough, when I first encountered the Lone Shadow Vilehand, his encounter irritated me to no end. I loathed this fight. 2 lone shadows in a tight space is a ridiculous ask, considering how difficult they are to land vitality damage on and how quickly they close the distance in a game not designed to fight more than one enemy at a time. But once I stepped back and remembered that I had ninjutsu, Vile Hand became one of the most unique fights in the game, using a small room that worked for the Ashina Elite's damage test alongside the unique moveset of the Lone Shadows. When you activate the Puppeteer ninjutsu on the mob Lone Shadow in the room, which you can reliably sneak attack, he'll start to attack the boss. However, Friendly Fire is still active against targets of ninjutsu, and those fast movements and sweeping motions mean that knowing when to attack the boss and when to get out of the way becomes an interesting choice. When combined with the fact that Vile Hand gains additional poison attacks that leave him uniquely vulnerable, this becomes a variation of a common mini-boss that has a really specific identity. On top of that, Vile Hand's world placement makes him a fascinating optional boss. You don't need to beat him to reach the bosses at the top of the tower, but beating him not only makes the run to the bosses easier, but provides more potential health. It takes advantage of the level design, abilities the player has unlocked, and provides enough variation within the core moveset to be a satisfying optional battle. The Lone Shadow Vile Hand earns a B grade, and personally is my favorite of the many varieties of Lone Shadow fights. Having an individual identity, even as a repeated mini-boss, is absolutely critical. And with that said, I really hope that Lone Shadow Masanaga the Spearbearer didn't hear the last comment, because he's got 2 entries coming up on this list that both linger behind Vile Hand. The first encounter against him on the castle outskirts is the first one we're talking about, and it's got a couple interesting things going for it. First, the dense brush that was once used to hide monkeys ends up now serving as a tool Masanaga uses to hide, making it harder to see what he's doing next in a more intentional way than the first Lone Shadow. By the time you've reached Masanaga, you probably know Lone Shadows like the back of your hand, so making it harder to tell exactly what he's doing, but still enough that you can see the general vibe, serves as a good test of the creature itself. Second, Masanaga seems to know who you are, calling you out directly as he attacks. With the moveset placed in a wide open space, it gives it time to actually shine, unlike the Longswordsman. With the foliage adding enough of a hazard to add flair without frustration, the one issue is that there isn't any reason to be here. There's no change in the area past Masanaga. He is standing on the edge of everything changed in Ashina, because that's where he stands. Kinda like the chained ogre. There's no change in Ashina Castle past Masanaga. He is on the outskirts of it all, standing here just because that's where he was put. Kinda like the second chained ogre, he feels irrelevant to the level design proper. He's looking over the corpses of some murdered friends, but that doesn't make him feel any less out of the way overall. One of Sekiro's biggest mistakes with mini-bosses on the return trips is some bizarre placement. Personally, I prefer when they have an interesting interaction with their level, reusing rooms in creative ways to create this unique sense of progression as you re-explore the area. But even with that criticism, Masanaga is still an alright fight. He earns a C grade. The Lone Shadows are still decent enemies, and Masanaga doesn't have anything detracting him from that like the Longswordsman did. For the battle on the tower, we'll start with the Shura ending, which means beginning by killing the healer who supported you throughout this entire game, Emma, the Gentle Blade. First, the atmosphere within both the cutscenes building up to the fights in this ending are really fun. Emma looks incredible, and this slow sword draw is ridiculously slick. With that said, this brings us to a bit of a strange question. Every time you fight the final boss of this ending, you have to fight Emma. Does that mean Emma is the first phase of the final boss of the Shura route, or does she stand on her own feet as an encounter? How distinct do the boss phases need to be in order to be counted as different bosses? What makes Emma different from the King of the Storms, and is it unfair to the battle with Isshin that follows after to separate Emma? Or was it unfair to the Nameless King not to separate the King of the Storms? I think for the most part, these unique first phase bosses should often be bundled together. The King of the Storms is a part of the Nameless King encounter. Genichiro is a part of Isshin Ashina. But sometimes, a boss is so distinct and the tone varies so wildly that it just feels unfair not to discuss them separately. Emma and Isshin are wildly different bosses, and later in the series, Radagon and the Elden Beast will be similarly different and deserve different spots. It's worth talking about how they relate, yes, but reducing Emma to a first phase for a wholly different boss minimizes her accomplishments within design. Emma makes use of a wide array of combat arts and grabs, all of which deal significant damage with unusual timings. Gentle Blade definitely fits her as a title, as each of the attacks have an almost relaxed rhythm to them, unlike her walk animation where it looks like she's coming to rip out your fucking spine. She's great at deflecting attacks, like most endgame bosses, but she lacks a lot of vitality and posture recovery. What Emma's moveset does beautifully that I believe makes her earn her own individual spot on a list of bosses is a synchronization of gameplay and story. If you play defensively against Emma, she'll chase you down with grabs and combat arts that excel at breaking through your defenses while giving her time to reduce her posture damage. To succeed against Emma without utilizing resources, something highly encouraged by being linked to that later battle, you have to be the constant aggressor. Her combat arts are best dodged by staggering her out of them, so to best beat Emma, you have to embrace Shura in terms of playstyle, rather than simply just within the story. Every time you retreat and reposition, Emma regains the upper hand. She wants to be in neutral. You have to rush her down to keep on that pressure until you get that amazing final blow that I still consider the most brutal yet beautiful death in the game. Even with only that single health bar, the atmosphere, gameplay, and story here coalesce almost perfectly. She earns a high A grade, verging heavily towards S. The only reason she's robbed of that S grade is that she isn't a full boss. She is a single moment distilled down to build up towards an encounter. And I never want to fight her again because killing her always makes me feel so insanely guilty, like holy shit. Meanwhile, I have a lot less love for the Shura variant of Isshin Ashina. He's not bad, don't get me wrong, far from it, but I don't think he holds a candle to the true final boss fight or even to the battle that precedes him. His first phase is similar to his alternate form, but with a couple changes. My personal favorite is that, if you and he are both in a neutral position, instead of deflecting your attack, he'll dodge around the attack and counterattack. Now you can still keep a pressure against that, but it means you have to watch for more than just being deflected. He also uses a number of combat arts that aren't too tough to dodge around, and there's a great rhythm to the fight. Isshin Ashina's second phase, however, is where the fight starts to lose me. Visually, it looks great. The arena lights on fire as Isshin starts to add after effects to each of his combat arts. The Ichimonji with fire isn't bad, but I don't like any of the other arts here. The first is him tearing up the ground with a tracking burst of flame, which hits you in the air and tracks incredibly well. If jumping dodged the attack, that could add a fun spin, but it doesn't, which makes it more frustrating than anything. The worst is his Firestorm slash attack. The fire bursts are hard to look around and mess with the camera, and the oncoming attack has too many attacks that happen too fast, also hitting through block like a lot of combat arts. Unlike Ashina Cross, this is almost impossible to fully deflect, especially since it's not really easy to get to a point where you can practice and learn against this move. But the biggest issue I have with the Shura version of Isshin is also the biggest benefit that Emma had. The best way to engage with Isshin is not to engage. Interrupt the firestorm with firecrackers, dodge behind his fire attacks. This becomes a fight of avoidance rather than confronting. It does the opposite thing Emma does, encouraging passivity over aggression, and unlike lightning, there is no high-risk counter option to the most devastating attacks. I think the final boss of the Shura ending just manages a B grade. Though the game still makes you feel like a monster, Emma and the cutscene that follows Isshin Ashina's death do more to push towards that than this fight does. And there's only so far that the admittedly tight design of Isshin Ashina as a sword fighter can go. Throughout the story of Sekiro, Genichiro is almost certainly the main villainous force, but in terms of the strongest contender for the title of pure villain, the great Shinobi Owl is a hard contender. He raised you as his lapdog, betrayed Lord Kuro to attain immortality, and now leads the ministry into Ashina for his own means. He is both evil and your dad. which everyone knows means he is a top tier villain, and that's just anime science. His fight is also beautifully written. Miyazaki has mentioned the fights against Great Shinobi Owl are among his favorite boss fights he's ever made, and I can see where that's coming from. It is an incredible duel. Significantly larger than most other swordsmen, his posture regenerates about as fast as you'd expect, which draws the fight out as you slowly wear down this beast of a man. Combine that with the arena that feels half the size as it did when you fought Genichiro, namely to Owl now being twice your size, and you have yourself an incredible battle. In terms of moveset, Owl mirrors the wolf's combat style despite his increased size. He uses tools you have access to via your prosthetic arm. He has anti-healing orbs he'll drop, he can throw shuriken, and then use an accessible combat art that darts forward after you parry them away. He uses spin attacks, he spams firecrackers just like any good Sekiro player, and even Mikiri counters you if you try to use a thrust attack on him. And that's only in the first phase. Moving around him and finding the few weaknesses in his defenses is ridiculously satisfying. The longsword is also used to great effect here, giving the attacks a unique pacing as he spins and whips his blade around the arena. His animations rely a lot on preparing an attack and then bursting from that prepared animation to the conclusion of the strike ridiculously quickly. When you combine that with throwing in a few larger blows that really sell the power of the sword, it makes Owl feel ridiculously and almost inhumanly strong with the speed he's able to achieve. And when you reach the second phase, he just keeps dialing everything up. He can create smoke clouds, forcing you to block attacks without using the lock-on. He can throw down lingering poison to make the small arena feel even smaller, and he uses posture recovery moves after trying to trap you in place with said poison. There is so much going on, and the moves all interact in such a unique way that when it combines with the music, it just becomes so much fun to fight. But speaking of fun, that brings me to the best part of this fight, his dialogue. Owl is treating the entire fight as if it's a sparring match, and it is brilliant. He shouts the shinobi code at you, screaming it at your corpse after he knocks you down. He does this fake-out death as he enters into phase 2, either scolding you for falling for his trick, or complimenting you for attacking him while he was down. The entire encounter is this perfect dive into the late game. When Miyazaki said that this is one of his favorite fights that he's designed, he was absolutely right. It is an easy S-grade boss, even though I believe it is somehow eclipsed by other fights in this game. I referenced a second fight against Lone Shadow Masanaga, the Spear Bearer, in his first battle, and this one definitely has more of a unique flavor than the first. You face Masanaga in a flaming building in your past, because you time traveled again, and he gains an attack that, if he completes it, will summon 2 dogs to fight alongside him. These dogs can also stack, which can make the fight get out of hand very quickly. The name of the game here is testing if you're able to stay completely attached to Masanaga. He'll try to hop away, of course, being a lone shadow, but you have to keep the pressure on throughout this. If you do, he's just a standard lone shadow that doesn't pose much of a threat this deep into the game. But as soon as the dogs come out, though, the fight gets 10 times harder. This is a great concept for an endgame gank fight where the dogs are the punishment for failing to display mastery of this common enemy. Taking this lone shadow down without his dogs being summoned is one of my favorite things to do. That said, I do think he has a little less going for him than Vilehand due to the simpler moveset. He does, however, still earn a B grade. The second visit to the Kawarada estate has a rematch with not just a lone shadow, but also with Juzuo. With more endgame abilities, there are a lot more ways to approach this fight, but the fight still struggles with the overload of mobs. The atmosphere that held the first Juzuo up has worn its welcome by the time you reach him, and a rematch with him doesn't carry any story weight. Learning that Juzuo was hired by the Lone Shadows to attack the estate isn't enough to justify a rematch in the same arena required to reach the boss here. Though Masanaga reappearing in a new arena was a fun shake-up to see the same boss with the same name reappear, I struggle to get behind another harder fight against Juzuo, especially since there's already a much better use of the Drunkard enemy with endgame stats in the third visit to Ashina Castle. It ends up just making Juzuo feel unnecessary and bloating out this area further. I think the second battle with Juzuo the Drunkard gets a low C grade and is by far the weakest of the Drunkards. The only reason he still gets an average grade is because I just love the Drunkard enemies so much. But following a poor enemy reuse, we get what is unquestionably the best rematch in the game. Owl Father. When you return to Lady Butterfly's arena, you find the man who killed you in that original fight 3 years ago. Your father, Owl. You move up to him, and the fight begins in the same arena you died in. But the tone has changed from Great Shinobi Owl. The playful mockery is gone. The father who was sparring with you is gone. This is Owl, and he's here to win. His tricks are gone. There's no poison, no healing debuffs. They've been replaced with all-out aggression. He'll now use the Mist Raven to teleport around you for surprise attacks. His combos last longer and hit harder, and he has more varied timings, particularly during his teleports. The arena is larger, but the Owl remains amazing at closing the distance with these new mobility options. He'll often even take advantage of the distance, taking a moment to recover his posture before he teleports right back to you. The biggest change is in his second phase, where he summons an owl that fights alongside him. It flies around, almost random, until he suddenly grabs it from the air and throws it as a sweep attack that he always follows up on. It is an incredible looking move, and it serves as an amazing way to build tension and add even more variation to his timings. To wrap it up, killing him serves as this beautiful character moment as the owl has a chance to say his final words.
Defeated by my own son?
This fight is Sekiro distilled to its finest points. The atmosphere, combat, and story coalesce into this dream duel. It is very obviously an S-grade fight, and one of my favorite fights in the series. And much like Genichiro, Owl Father even has an inner fight, which just ups the aggression even more. Instead of teleporting once into an attack, this version of Owl will sometimes teleport 3 or 4 times in a row, attacking after each. It is an excellent heightening of an already great fight, and honestly would also be an S grade if I were ranking those, but Owl already has 2 S grades, and I can't have the entire S grade of this series just be multiple variations of Owl. And immediately after, we get another rematch far above the quality of the first. This time, with the true Corrupted Monk, the Corrupted Monk's moveset finally comes into its own. One of the best things about Sekiro is how it does its boss rematches. Every instance of a recurring enemy often feels intentional, adding a variation to justify its existence. Even though the unique boss count might be lower, each fight often has individual value. The entrance to Fountainhead Palace is astonishing. Sekiro is often criticized for many areas feeling too similar in terms of design, but it makes the moment you arrive in the palace and witness the sheer burst of color astonishing. You sit at your first idol, step onto a bridge, and learn why that monk was upset before. It's because you were too close to her magical cherry blossom bridge. This time, the Corrupted Monk boasts all 3 of its health bars, though with endgame stats and resources, it's much less terrifying than that makes her sound. The first phase is almost identical to her Ashina Depths variant, but without the weakness to Snap Seeds anymore. You can still use firecrackers and fistfuls of ash to cheese through one of these phases, but with 3 phases, the weakness ends up being a lot less of a problem for the fight as a whole. The first phase also surpassed the first variant by interacting with the arena. As she spins and slams, snow and leaves will fly into the air. The restrictive bridge also works wonders, not only forcing you to face the monk's glaive head-on, but also for the sheer visual wonder the attacks cause. The weight behind each blow is felt, whether deflected or dodged. The second phase is intimidating and frankly seems insane as it starts, but is actually the easiest phase by a pretty wide margin. She enters a praying stance in the center of the arena, and clones of her begin to appear and attack from multiple directions. To take her down, you can grapple up to a branch, and then do a jumping death blow. It's honestly a bit underwhelming, but it does serve as a neat puzzle that can be pretty scary in a first go-around. If there was less going on in the other 2 phases, I'd give it a harder time, but it practically means this boss has 2 phases and a more engaging transition between them than usual. The third phase here is technically deadlier, but I often find it easier to handle than the first. The monk reveals its secret as a centipede bursts out of its neck. Her attacks become more frantic and animalistic, with more of an emphasis on slams than the graceful spins the first phase was utilizing. There's also a dangerous terror spit attack that provides an opportunity for vitality damage if you can manage to dodge around it. Altogether, the True Corrupted Monk feels like a great start to one of the best areas in Sekiro. The difficulty increase is notable without ever being overwhelming, and though the first encounter lacked its own impact, it does empower this encounter by making what would otherwise be a random obstacle evolve into a minor antagonist. I personally give the True Corrupted Monk an A grade. I do wish the second phase was a little more involved, but the gameplay is solid enough that the first and second phases are able to hold their own. Whoever was sitting in the From Software offices and decided that they needed a second Blazing Bull needs to stop and reassess. Sakura, the Bull of the Palace, is a little bit better than the Blazing Bull, however, for a couple of reasons. First, Sakura does not increase burn every time that they hit you, meaning you can now actually deflect their attacks. It's strange to see abilities removed from bosses moving towards endgame, but it is a welcome change. Second, your damage is much higher, particularly if you've done the optional bosses up to this point. The fight being shorter makes it a lot more bearable, especially since fighting it as intended isn't actively discouraged by the game anymore. Finally, you can also use firecrackers on the roof and startle it into its bucking attack right off the bat, which means you don't have to fight it because it dies instantly, and that is great. Welcome to the bottom of D grade, Sakura Bull of the Palace. Please leave the game on your way out. But now it's time for Miss Noble 2 Electric Boogaloo. I joke, but Okami leader Shizu does put up more of a fight than Miss Noble did, often managing to swing once while you run towards her before she collapses into the shreds of wet paper she's built from. The strange choice here is that there are a number of normal enemies in the area who use the same combat style, but Shizu puts up less of a fight than they do. On top of that, she only has 1 health bar, so she drops even faster than Miss Noble did. I think Okami leader Shizu is a less interesting environmental hazard than the Miss Noble 2. Shizu is a damage wall that discourages players from traveling into the second half of the palace until they've looped around the surface area and taken her out. The wall can be avoided with some careful dodging, also known as knowing how to press circle very fast, but it's much less interesting than the mist vanishing from the forest. With the Miss Noble, you can tell when it's dead. It feels like it affects the entire level, whereas killing Shizu feels less significant. Why doesn't someone else just take her place? Like Miss Noble, Okami leader Shizu is an F-grade encounter, and one of the few places that the palace's level design misses the mark. I also think it's a strange pattern that both of these strange, ineffective bosses are based off of enemies that pose more of a risk than they do. And finally, reaching the end of the Fountainhead Palace, we reach the Divine Dragon, who is more a spectacle than an actual boss, and, well, it certainly looks spectacular. There are, however, 2 phases, and the first phase definitely lingers behind the second. Upon entering the arena, there are these wooden dragon priests that begin to form. They do take a surprising number of hits to take down, but after they summon trees, you can do these leaping death blows to take out a whole group at a time. This phase is, to put it mildly, irritating. It doesn't naturally build towards the main phase, and the enemies feel bizarrely tanky. Though the death blow is satisfying to land the first couple of times, it feels almost like a fix implemented after the fight was dragging too long. If this phase were being scored in a vacuum, it'd probably get a D grade, maybe an F grade, depending on how it ended. Thankfully, the Divine Dragon does eventually show its face, and the first thing to mention is the dragon's impeccable design. It is built into the ground itself, is missing the same arm as you, and meshes with the arena design absolutely perfectly. Designing the fight to keep you at a distance does a great job to make the camera stay calm and clear, avoiding the pitfalls of similar cinematic bosses like Yorm. The gameplay aspect of this cinematic fight is just alright. The Divine Dragon will do a variety of air slashes or a huge sweep attack with his sword. You block or you jump around, needing to hop onto these trees to grab a bolt of lightning and hit him. Now, if you've done every fight before this, it'll look like you're reducing his vitality, but it's actually his posture that fills perfectly, which does a great job standardizing the fight regardless of your current attack power. There are a couple of pretty sizable issues though. When the fight works, it works well, but the dragon attacks faster than your grappling hook moves. There are often situations where you'll start a grapple and then he'll start an attack, you'll grab the lightning, get knocked out of the air, and then take damage because you didn't throw the lightning. All that will usually combine to kill you. On top of that, he often pushes you back almost randomly, so you have to run towards him again, which drags the fight out. He doesn't do anything unique after pushing you back either, he just continues to use the same attacks, making this unavoidable reset a strange choice in terms of pacing the battle. The ending of the fight, however, is absolutely stunning. Once you get him one hit away from death, he uses the only pushback that feels necessary and begins a storm of attacks. You can deflect the wind waves and jump the sweeps as you slowly press back forward. The available trees are reduced, and as you leap to grab the final lightning, you get what I believe is the most cinematic moment in the entirety of Sekiro. The dragon's final desperate swings throw you further and further into the air until you come face to face with it as it tries to take a bite of you. This slow motion frame is absolutely gorgeous, and it ends the moment you press attack, smashing the dragon to the ground, now unable to defend itself. The highs of this fight, that ending, the music, the arena, the design, are some of Sekiro's highest points. But the fight is so strangely paced and has a wholly unnecessary first phase. Even with these very massive faults, the fight is still solidly in the B grade for me. I wish I had a little more time to reach that pinnacle it feels like it's brushing against, but it's honestly just not quite there. So, this next set of bosses before we reach the final stretch of the game is what I call the upsetting corner of bosses, because all of them make me upset. So let's start with one of the optional endgame memory fights. The Guardian Ape is one of my favorite bosses of all time, so what do I think of the Headless Ape? Well, it's the worst memory boss in the game, though I also struggle to count it as one, and if there were a mod to remove it, it'd be gone in an instant. Let's start with the gameplay here. The Headless Ape's first phase is a repeat of the Guardian Ape's second phase, but in a worse arena. The camera isn't bad here, but it doesn't work as well as it did in the wide open space. The second phase then adds in a weak Guardian Ape who fights alongside the Headless Ape, making this the only duo memory fight in the game. Unless you count the folding screen monkeys, but I don't. I've slightly alluded to this before, but Sekiro is not designed for fighting multiple enemies at once, and this proves that rule. The best way to take them down is to spam firecrackers on the weaker ape or use the Mortal Blade. Even then, the Guardian Ape's size makes it difficult to attack when not locked on, and locking onto one ape makes it impossible to see the other due to the fact that the camera focuses so heavy on that ape. With the speed each ape moves, staying unlocked just isn't reasonable on its own. From a meta perspective, I also find this fight aggravating. This fight rewards the player with a ninjutsu, 2 prayer beads, and a memory. There is no other boss in the game that holds that much loot. Usually, a mini-boss will have 1 prayer bead, a memory boss will have 1 memory. This has double what a mini-boss does, more than a boss does, and a ninjutsu on top of that. I do not know why the Headless Ape has so much stuff locked behind it, particularly since from a story standpoint, the fight is aggravating. This Headless Ape is the same one that you had just fought in the Sunken Valley. You didn't sever its immortality with the Mortal Blade, so now it is back for revenge, which has a couple of problems. Of course, yes, you can kill the Guardian Ape before the folding screen monkeys, meaning it is possible to not have the Mortal Blade when you fight the Guardian Ape. However, considering Kuro's hints as to what area to search, as well as the Guardian Ape's difficulty, this is an incredibly likely scenario. And reminder, at the end of the Headless Ape fight, the ape turned to dust. It didn't collapse, waiting for immortality to be severed. It apparently teleported away to just fight you another day. This is an aggravating little story beat that frankly makes Wolf seem like an absolute moron. He knows what centipedes mean from the beginning. He knows he has the anti-immortal sword, and he knows the monkey didn't die when he killed it. So why didn't he kill it? The Headless Ape gets an F grade, but though he's the worst memory fight, he's not the worst fight in the game. We're about to get to all of that. So these next 2 entries are cheating the format of the rest of this series a little bit, because I didn't know when to talk about these fights. There are 5 fights with the Headless in Sekiro, making them the most common mini-boss. 3 are grounded versions, and 2 are fought underwater, and though they have a great atmosphere, honestly one of the best atmospheres in the entire game, none of them are good fights. You cannot fight the Headless when you first find them, which is why I didn't include them when they're encountered. Unless you use Divine Confetti, they are completely immune to damage, and Divine Confetti is pretty rare until the late game, since most of your yen will be going towards gourd, seeds, and prosthetic devices. Even if you do activate Confetti early in the game, your damage is frankly pitiful, meaning the Headless are definitely designed for you to come back to them somewhere after the halfway point of the game. And on top of that, every time you don't land a perfect deflect on a pretty weird to deflect creature, it builds up terror, meaning you'll also want to have found the purple gourd to reduce that, because if that bar fills up, you instantly die. There is a little satisfaction to be gained from running around, exploring the world, and finding what you need to come back to what was previously unbeatable and taking it down. On top of that, the Headless are unlike anything else in the game. Learning to fight them feels like learning a whole new rhythm. And as I mentioned, the groundless Headless nail their atmosphere. There are 2 in caves and 1 in that Mist Noble forest that works both before and after the noble is killed. Their music is incredible, and the animation team did another great job creating these horrifying monsters. The lumbering is uncanny, and there's some really fun Japanese mythology being referenced in each of their moves, particularly their grab. However, for an enemy that demands perfect deflections, having some of the strangest delays in conjunction with a slowing aura that makes dodging difficult ends up being more frustrating than engaging. The one attack that I really enjoy is the grab attack. The Headless vanishes suddenly as you're attacking it and appears behind you and attacks. If it grabs you, dealing a decent chunk of damage and building up more terror. But if you turn around and look at it, it will stop its attack, nervous that you found it. The thing that I think really takes away from the Headless is the fact that you need Divine Confetti, particularly for a boss that demands perfect play like they do. Unless you've waited until endgame to outlevel them, demanding the use of a rare consumable is a frustrating twist. Demanding a consumable rarely serves as a detailed mechanic. It often instead just discourages new players from attempting or experimenting against bosses. Though they may not have prayer beads, they do have the reusable sugars, which are pretty important items as you continue into later game cycles. I've never fought the Headless when the game seems to intend for you to. I get as many memories as possible, then backtrack and deal with them then. Every time I fight them when it is intended, I end up needing to use too many resources for it to seem worthwhile. In terms of the arena, the one nearby Mist Noble is definitely the best. In the mist, it looks incredibly cool, and even without, it blends perfectly into the already unnatural feeling forest. The cave ones are both fine, but the caves don't add as much stripping atmosphere as the forest does. The underwater Headless are frankly even worse when it comes to gameplay. Though you don't have to use Divine Confetti, namely because you can't activate Divine Confetti underwater, you lose access to pacifying agents, which are your best solution against terror. On top of that, underwater combat is, to put it mildly, not great. These are the only underwater bosses in the game, unless you count that stealth section against the carp, which is kind of finicky on its own. The only way to dodge is to swim in circles as they use homing and slashing attacks. You'll hop in, get a couple of hits, and then dart back out. The Fountainhead Palace variation is even more frustrating as he summons a clone to help, attacking you from 2 directions and removing opportunities to dive in for damage. All of the Headless earn F grades, though there is some variation in severity. The underwater version in the Palace is the worst, followed by the underwater one in Ashina Castle. If they didn't require Divine Confetti, the grounded ones would each land in D grade, but as it stands, the one in the Gun Fort is 3rd, followed by the Ashina Outskirts battle, and then the forest variation being my favorite. I wish they only did terror when they successfully hit rather than were just blocked, or didn't require Divine Confetti, because the grounded ones suffer quite a bit from those 2 pieces of design. The underwater ones, however, if those were removed from the game tonight, I would be a happy man and never notice. But the worst boss in Sekiro is all 3 of the Shichimen Warriors. Firstly, they all drop little of value, so unlike the Headless, they're not even worth fighting, except for the last one, but that one drops a lapis lazuli, and there are other ways to get that in your first 2 playthroughs, so technically you could even skip that. Their atmosphere is nowhere near the Headless, and their animations are far less impressive to me. Shichimen Warriors will use ranged attacks and summons to inflict terror, with the goal of, similarly, instantly killing you rather than using damage. Unlike Headless, they each have 2 health bars, they can teleport away from melee attacks, and they have no designed openings, namely because their summoned attacks overlap with ranged attacks that did leave openings. The best way to fight them, I found, is to get the Purple Lotus umbrella and walk slowly towards them until you can deal burst damage to kill them. There is very little in Sekiro as bizarrely designed as these warriors. Their attacks aren't often deflectable and are wide enough that the step dodge struggles to avoid them. Hitboxes are larger and less distinct than other AoEs, and the bright colors struggle to invoke the same atmosphere as Headless. There are 3 encounters with the Shichimen Warriors, and this time only one really provides any atmosphere. The worst variation is in the Fountainhead Palace. The purple attacks don't stick out against the brighter environment, and the arena is too thin for this boss enemy, often making his attacks obnoxious to dodge around as he teleports from one edge to all the way down at the other one. It's just way too big. Next is the one in the Ashina Depths, who only summons after you kill the Headless Ape. This room is, congratulations, my least favorite room in the game, by the way. Not only do both the bosses present there fail to engage the player in any meaningful way, but there is no natural reason to return to the cave. It is completely out on the edge of the map. Nothing nearby it has changed as the game has progressed. There's just bosses in here that spawn at some point. The best of the Shichimen Warriors is definitely the one by the dungeon. The purple stands out really well against the brown walls here, and the visual introduction of the enemy down in the pit below builds a great sense of dread that the fight does sadly fail to deliver on. Earning F grades across the board, these guys are an easy choice for the worst bosses in Sekiro, with all 3 landing under Headless Ape. But now that we've cleared out that section of not-so-great bosses, we are back to the normal Sekiro fare in our final visit to Ashina Castle, the last area of the game. Sekiro is rarely a scary game, but the Ashina elite Ujinari Mizuo always jump scares me. I honestly just forget that he's there, and I run down the stairs from Isshin's room to be instantly one-tapped by an Ashina cross. Ujinari is similar to Jinsuke, but his damage and aggression are jacked up even higher in an even smaller room. He's got a bit more posture, but still sits as a deflection do-or-die test. I have a lot less goodwill for him than his earlier counterpart because his design doesn't feel like a boss that needed to be repeated. If we needed a red-eyed version of an early game boss, maybe use a general or a 7 Ashina spears, something with a more engaging moveset rather than a pure mechanical test. To reach this point, you'll have beaten Genichiro Owl, the true corrupted monk. You've proven you can deflect attacks. He earns a high D grade. Though it's not insulting, his design is too simple to earn its placement as one of the last 5 battles in the entire game. But whereas one rematch fails, another succeeds. It may have taken 4 attempts, but we finally found it. A balanced Drunkard fight. Shigekichi of the Red Guard is a great skin for the Drunkard, the poison breath being replaced by a flaming breath as he leads a horde of ministry fighters in the Outskirts looks so insanely cool. The changes to the model make him feel unique, and the Drunkard's moveset remains complicated enough to serve as a suitable endgame challenge. The thing that makes Shigekichi my favorite Drunkard is that his arena is not only more designed for stealth, with the enemies each being separated enough to take out with careful play, but you have enough tools and sugars at this point that the tools to handle such a massive horde are present this time. This is the same arena we once fought General Tenzen Yamauchi in, and where Yamauchi struggled to reach you, Shigekichi moves fast enough that the same cheese strategies fail while the stealth-focused multi-layered arena design still shines. Unlike other Drunkard fights with weaker enemies, I find myself less concerned about much harder foes, which goes to show you about what enemy placement within a map can really do. I wish we had more rematches like this that establish a standard for a boss and then twist that to tell a story. The other Drunkards were these wild, untrained warriors, mercenaries that couldn't be trusted. Shigekichi fights that same way, but there is a focus he has, the focus of the ministry. Without knowing anything else about this man, there is a story being told just through the reuse of this enemy, which creates an incredible, naturalistic sense of world building. Shigekichi earns that solid A grade that I have wanted to give the Drunkards since the beginning of this video. And when you combine his incredible design with the rest of the gauntlet that is the Ashina Outskirts at this point in the game, he also serves as the perfect appetizer for the boss that follows immediately after. The first time I played Sekiro, the Demon of Hatred was among my least favorite bosses. But as I fought him again and again, run after run, and finally learned how he works, I have gained more respect for what this boss does for the game's lineup than I think I've gained respect for any other boss. Demon of Hatred is unlike any other boss in the game. Even the Guardian Ape, with his flailing arms and massive size, still followed the game's basic rules of deflection. Demon of Hatred feels like a boss from a different game, with his few deflectable attacks all knocking you back and making it hard to ever respond. You cannot deflect any of his slams or jumps, forcing you to run around and grapple back in to punish, and you'll be draining all 3 of his health bars, with most prosthetics doing absolutely nothing. The only one that does anything is the Malcontent Whistle, which will give you a total of 3 stuns for the full fight. Yet despite all of this, there is something so incredible about this fight and what it demands in terms of mastery. His moveset is dynamic, which at this point in Sekiro isn't much of a surprise, but it still works well to make the demon feel alive. While you're close, he'll do stomps and a massive belly flop. The belly flop may seem scary, but it serves as one of the easiest opportunities to back off, then grapple back into the explosion to keep the pressure on. The demon is most threatening, ironically, when he's at a distance. He has a charge sweep that jumping somehow avoids, an absurd reach with his flaming arm, creates rings of fire that he can pass through that trap you, creates homing fireballs, and he leaves lingering damage zones that reduce your mobility against a boss that removes every method of defense outside of that mobility. Much like many of the other memory bosses on this list, the atmosphere is nailed. From the beginning of the game, you'll hear about Shura and the demons it creates. Hear the sculptor talk about his past and his gratitude to Isshin for stopping him from becoming a demon. But then when the war finds him again, reaches your home base, the sculptor breaks and you find your savior here, indiscriminately killing anything and everything in sight. The final thank you at the end of the fight is such a beautiful touch that makes this side boss feel important, while making it optional keeps the unique and often overwhelming design it has from feeling frustrating. Sekiro lacked much of the significant side content that From Software games had started to become known for, with Owl Father and everything preceding it being required for certain endings. Defeating it provides you a memory, yes, but the Demon of Hatred is a personal demon to overcome for both Wolf and the player. And I still find myself, after all this time, still wanting to swing by to face the sculptor on my casual playthroughs, because killing him is such an emotionally cathartic moment within the frame of this story. The Demon of Hatred earns an A grade, missing out on the S grade because, well, the core of the game is missing out of the fight. That said, I wouldn't have given him anything near as high on my first playthrough. This is, without a doubt, the From Software boss that has grown on me more than any other encounter in the series. But after raving about an absurdly difficult endgame fight, it is time to complain about an absurdly difficult endgame fight. The 7 Ashina Spears was one of my favorite mini-boss molds, and the generals are fun enemies that I wish there were more evolved versions of. So the battle against the 7 Ashina Spears, Shume Masaji Oniwa, and his general sounds great. That's sarcasm, it's not really great. I mentioned the Headless Ape is the only gank fight. It's not entirely true, because this exists, and though it's not as bad, it is still an aggravating fight. The movesets still work great individually, but there's 2 big issues. First, the 7 spears are not designed to be fought with anything nearby. They throw out so many attacks with such a strange rhythm that they require your entire focus to engage with, which again is a good thing. They are immaculately designed mini-bosses. The generals are simpler, yes, but they attack frequently enough that even with basic mobs, things can quickly become overwhelming. On top of this, the arena is not built for a duo fight, something pillars in Ornstein and Smell, but the only way to avoid aggro in this arena is to stand on a branch and completely break their AI. There is almost no space here at all. This is probably one of the hardest duos to separate in the entire series. And to make things worse, when the fight begins, they are standing in the middle of an open space, facing each other, which means stealth, even when using the stealth sugar, is not much of an option. You can hop around wildly and eventually try to get something in once they've forgotten about you and are moving back to their positions, but that's easier said than done. The fight feels like methods to overcome them haven't been planned, which is a shame because I adore both of these enemies in a vacuum. Because of this, the fight earns a D grade. Once the general is dead, I love refighting an endgame 7 Ashina spears, but it's just an unsatisfying encounter that ends up proving more frustrating than nostalgic. But finally, we come to the end. My personal favorite boss in the entire catalog of From Software games, Isshin, the Sword Saint. Figuring out where to start with this boss is tough, because there is so much going on, so you know what, let's just get started. To begin, you return to the same field you lost your arm in at the beginning of the game. I didn't go over it too much in Genichiro, since you really just lose here, but the arena is gorgeous. The flowers go just high enough to be present without making it difficult to see, which is a tough line to tread. It's spacious, and the rocks amid the arena are just enough to be hazardous without being obnoxious. You face Genichiro again here in a one-phase battle, and though it doesn't feel as individualistic of a boss as Emma did, he builds the atmosphere just as well. He starts in his glass cannon phase, but replaces his lightning with slow mortal blade strikes. And facing the man who took your arm in the same arena with the tables completely turned is ridiculously cinematic. By the time you've claimed your final victory against Isshin, this phase is a speed bump at best. Compared to your fights with Owl or the monk, Genichiro feels like he's moving in slow motion at this point in the game. The dialogue is great for building tension, and then he drops. Genichiro flows so naturally into Isshin, and serves as more proof of your growth than a new, unique foe, which feels like an invitation into the absolutely brutal battle that is Isshin. I haven't been breaking down intro cutscenes in Sekiro too much beyond the fact that they look really cool, but everything happening here is perfect. If you've watched any other Sekiro video on YouTube, they'll have told you about the fact that Wolf goes from struggling to draw his sword at the start of the game to drawing it perfectly here, and yes, he does that. That's visualized character growth in a From Software game, but my favorite thing here is the absolute insanity that is Isshin rising out of Genichiro's corpse. Isshin is one of From Software's better established characters within the game. You have so many conversations with him throughout everything. He's been talked about so much that you get a picture in your head of what this legend must have been. And rising here, taking his grandson's last wish, a wish Isshin himself has said he does not even believe in, and refusing to let it die, creates an incredible feeling. There is a weight and significance in this battle I adore. The sense of finality Isshin has is unmatched in gaming. There is no question this is your final challenge to overcome. This is what it's built to. In games as directionless as From Software games, I think one thing I've neglected to mention up to this point is the weight final bosses in general often have. True King Allant, Gwyn, Chandra, the Soul of Cinder, Radagon, and the Elden Beast, you can say what you will about the games, about the bosses themselves, but the fact that you can feel that you are at the final boss is amazing. And when you combine that talent, that ability From Software has, with the story weight Sekiro provides, Isshin carries the best of both worlds, imbuing a clear final boss from a story standpoint, and then adding that X factor that From Software brings to their world building and storytelling. Isshin boasts 3 phases, and all of them are almost completely mechanically unique. Getting through the fight means beating Genichiro and all 3 phases in one shot, which makes this the only fight that requires 4 health bars to be reduced with no break. It is easily the hardest fight in the game. My first playthrough, I sprinted around and took pot shots out of fear, but learning and engaging with his moveset is so ridiculously fun, and the one no-hit battle I ever got while practicing for my speedrun is possibly my greatest accomplishment in any game ever. Phase 1 features Isshin wielding the Mortal Blade. However, being Isshin, he refuses to use the Mortal Blade's power because he's just that fucking cool. He uses versions of the Ashina art so powerful they cause a storm to start building, because of course he can do that, why couldn't he do that? His attacks are all fast and brutal, but aggression pays off in a huge way here. If you keep in his face, you can build his posture. If you make one slip up though, he will tear your health bar apart in seconds, and he's defensive enough that damaging him is easier said than done, leading to a rapid posture recovery. But even with that aggression and defense, this phase serves as just a warm-up, practicing the fundamentals of Sekiro via positioning, deflecting, Mikiri counters, and stomping sweeps. Then, the second phase starts. In my personal experience, this phase is the single hardest phase of any boss in Sekiro. He draws the spear that he once gave Gyoubu and starts to dual-wield a spear and a sword, and his attack strings are ridiculous. Like Pontiff, they'll go on for 7 to 8 hits at a time with strange delays, but unlike Pontiff, you can't just run away, you have to learn and master it. The range on his spear is massive, and the Ashina arts become less punishable, and he gets his most famous attack, whipping out a gun and shooting it at you rapid fire. This man has come back from the dead, burst out of his adopted heir's neck, and is wielding a legendary blade without using its powers because he thinks they're lame. He's holding the spear of the man he killed to form his nation, and a fucking automatic that you can parry. He's hard to approach, he does a ton of damage, his posture recovers at an insane rate. Keeping the pressure on here is harder than ever because he has so many moves with hyper armor that will make him impossible to challenge. He will only stagger at very specific moments here. If there is a phase that wants you to know that you are outclassed, it is this. And during this entire time, the weather is continuing to get worse and worse as it turns into a full storm. One of my personal favorite attacks that I have to shout out is this long lunging thrust, and it is the most satisfying Mikiri counter in the game. I will literally never get tired of landing it. The final phase maintains the moveset of the second, but is thankfully far easier due to the one major change. He adds in lightning as the storm reaches its peak. The timing here is far more natural than Genichiro's, which is great for how demanding the rest of the moveset remains. Even if you don't contest the lightning, being able to dart behind him for free vitality damage is huge for getting the edge in this fight. The lighting escalation feels incredible with the building storm throughout the battle, and manages to make a repeated phase somehow more tense while also easier to get through. There are always exceptions, but once people make it past the second of the phases, they'll be able to get past the third pretty quickly after. My first ever experience with the game, I was stonewalled on the second phase. I could not get past it, attempt after attempt after attempt. The first time I beat that second phase, I beat the third phase right afterwards, because it trains you so well and builds to that climax so well. It is simultaneously challenging and cinematic. Once he finally loses that last health bar, he surrenders and gets a noble execution. I think it's important to note here, Isshin is one of the only bosses who doesn't try to get a final hit before they go down. Genichiro lunges forward, Owl tries to push himself up. Isshin here just drops to his knees and accepts his second death. Which brings me to my next point, his character. Hesitation is defeat might be one of my favorite lines in the game, and him giving you the name Sekiro earlier, and now calling you solely by that name as he's seen you broken from the thumb of Father Owl. He is so well characterized that it gives the fight such an incredible sense of life on top of this mechanical perfection. Every attack has a unique rhythm, and the skill challenge is sky high while still never feeling unfair. Unattainable for the first couple attempts, maybe, but never unfair. There are few moments as satisfying in any game as taking Isshin down, particularly on challenge runs. You'd think trying to fight him with 2 health upgrades and low resources in a speedrun would be frustrating, but it is one of my favorite parts of the run. I watch this fight and see exactly how much I've grown from running away from his combos to now tearing them apart with deflection strings. Isshin, the Sword Saint, is an easy S-grade boss, and my favorite boss in this entire series. On a bit of an underwhelming note to end on, Inner Isshin is probably the only inner boss that disappointed me. He doesn't feel particularly difficult. If you've beaten Isshin, you can beat Inner Isshin. He just does mortal blade attacks now. So if you know how to deal with those, you're good to go. He's still an S grade, yes, but it just wows me a little less than the other inner bosses. And with that is Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. Now the F grade obviously seems a little inflated, but you have to remember 8 of those are either Shichimen Warriors or Headless enemies. And without the mini-bosses including, this roster of bosses cleans up even better than Bloodborne with only 2 major missteps throughout the game, and the worst of those battles is skippable. But with the Wolf's Foes analyzed, that brings us at long last to Elden Ring. Or it would be if I hadn't played Demon Souls at this point. So, there's going to be one more video to come before we get to the golden goose of the From Software library. So I will see you next time for what's probably going to be the shortest video in the series, as we travel back in time to the birth of the Souls series. But also forward, because I played the PS5 version, so, I'm still kind of doing release order here. Either way, I'll see you next time.